So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the launch of the Wolfson Economics Prize. Since we launched the prize 10 months ago, it's been a huge pleasure for us at Policy Exchange to be involved, acting as the Secretariat of the prize. I think it's been not just a unique prize, but also uniquely intellectually valuable, prompting a credible outpouring of interesting research which has illuminated everything about the euro crisis that we're still suffering through. So it's been a huge pleasure for us to be involved in it, and I'd like to thank some of the people who have made it possible. I'd like to start by thanking the judges, and in particular the chair of the judges, Derek Scott, who I'm afraid isn't able to be here today because he's unfortunately ill. And I'd also like to thank Professor John Goodhart, who is able to stand in, for all their efforts over the last couple of months, sifting through all these different entries and reading different versions of them. I'd like to thank the entrants, the hundreds of entrants who applied to the prize, and particularly the finalists. A bit like the euro crisis itself, this prize has gone a little bit longer than we thought it would do. We've asked even more on finalists than we thought we would have all gone away and revised and improved all their entries before we get to this final awarding of the prize. I'd like to thank Westbourne, who helped drum up so many entries from all over the world of such good quality. And most of all, I would like to thank Simon Wolfson, who's made the whole thing possible. It's a fascinating initiative. I thought it was interesting for the very first moment you mentioned it. And when you have a very big problem like the euro crisis, you need a big solution, and we need a big prize to bring out the world's best economists and to contribute to fixing the problem. So there are copies at the back of the room, and the full entries of all of the finalists will be appearing on our website. And I'm going to now hand over to Simon Wolfson to say a little bit about the genesis of the prize and what he thinks of our final entries. Thank you very much for making it possible, Simon.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Neil, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you to Policy Exchange for all the work that you've done in association with Andrew Lillico in sifting and judging the prize, or helping the process of judging the prize. This prize has done so much more than I expected. It was designed to fill an intellectual void. It was designed to start a debate that needed to happen, but wasn't happening. And I've been surprised by several things. I've first of all, most pleasantly been surprised by the quality of the work the prize has produced, particularly the 5 shortlisted finalists. And it was instructive to me to see how much they were able to improve their entries, actually, between the first submission and the second. And I'd like to thank those 5 finalists for the amazing amount of hard work that they've put into these very impressive papers. The other thing that has been extraordinary about this prize is what it has done to spark debate and to begin a conversation that up until 6 months ago was a taboo. It was a forbidden conversation. It was something that couldn't happen and must not be spoken of. There are many things that we can, many emotions that we can feel when looking at the euro. It's acceptable for us to look in fear and trepidation at the thought of it breaking up. It is not acceptable for us to walk into the potential collapse of the euro in ignorance. And every day that goes past, unfortunately, the demise of the euro looks not less likely, but more likely. The multiple attempts to refinance the debts of Southern Europe are little more than that. They are refinancing debts that look no more or less likely to be paid back. And worryingly, the structural flaw at the heart of euro, the chronic overvaluation of Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Spain and Greece, and the uncompetitiveness and the unemployment that has caused. These bailouts do absolutely nothing to address that key issue, and unless they do, at some point the system is going to fall over. When that happens, we must not be left without a plan. I'd like to thank Roger and his team for providing an outstanding piece of work. It's clear, comprehensive, addresses all the major issues, and should serve as the starting point for any official beginning to think about this tricky issue. I'd also like to mention Jonathan Tepper and Jens Nordvik for their contributions, which I thought were excellent, and there's work in there that also needs to come to the attention of those who ultimately are going to have to solve this problem. The prize has been a great success, far more successful than I thought it was going to be. The winners have exceeded my expectations. They have provided, if you look at this as a return on investment, the return on investment of this prize has been outstanding. And on that note, I'd like to hand over to Charles, who very kindly is standing in for Derek as chairman of the judges today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. I wish I didn't have to stand in for Derek, because he is quite seriously ill, and I'm sure that you will all join me in devoutly wishing that he makes a complete and full recovery. I should add that I think that his job has not been entirely easy. It's not easy to ride herd on a bunch of academics, because academics are almost by their nature independent and strong-minded. I almost said opinionated and arrogant, but then I realized I'd be talking about myself. But Derek dealt with us all, as he has dealt with all his other problems recently, with calm, patience, wisdom, and a great deal of good sense. Indeed, about the only aspect of this exercise which came relatively easily for the judges as a group was actually choosing the best paper from the large number that was submitted. Because all of us, Manfred Neumann, Francesco Giavazzi, who's now a junior minister in Mario Monti's cabinet, Derek and myself, unanimously chose the paper submitted by Roger Bootle and his group from Capital Economics, a number of whom are here this morning, as being the best. And since Simon did mention the two other papers, I would actually say that the two other papers that I myself would like to make a reference to was the one by the two Nomura people, which raised some excellent points on some legal and market issues that could be applied, and also Jonathan Tepper's paper, partly in Jonathan Tepper, because he chose some wonderful quotations which made me laugh. And it's not often that you actually laugh while reading economics papers, particularly perhaps about the eurozone. Now, at times during this process, I've actually been worried that our deliberative exercise might get overtaken by a sudden intervening breakup. But it hasn't happened, because on each occasion when a crisis has appeared near, the eurozone authorities have done what in almost all cases, virtually the minimum necessary to keep the show on the road, largely by injecting just sufficient liquidity into the system to keep the ailing banks or the ailing governments going. Known, unfortunately, by the standard cliche of kicking the can down the road. But they have never yet actually faced up, if indeed some of them recognize it, to the underlying problems of the eurozone. The fact that growth in most of these countries in difficulties is way below the level of interest rates that they have to pay, which leads to simply disastrous debt dynamics, even if you get your public sector deficit down, insufficient competitiveness, and the excessive indebtedness. And frequently, the excessive indebtedness was not primarily, at any rate originally, within the public sector, but within the private sector. In most cases, the situation, though not in all cases, in most cases, the situation continues to worsen, with the inevitable result of rising political and social tensions. The implication of that is that unless everyone is extremely lucky, the can will simply run out of road and the kicking will have to stop. And at least some countries will have to turn with great attentiveness to what Roger and his colleagues at Capital Economics have written. So I'm expecting that Roger's paper will shortly get translated into at least one and probably several other European languages, which means, of course, that Roger will have to pay EU VAT for services to other EU countries. But in the intervening period, before his work or their work becomes the Vade Mecum, or the Bible that they may need to follow under certain circumstances, I would very much like to take the opportunity of awarding the prize, a huge and heavy, I'm not quite certain what it's called, but anyhow, it's the prize. You'll have to be very, you'll need to put it down. If you carry it throughout while speaking, you will, you'll get very
absolutely
tired.
right. It is extremely heavy. Well, thank you very much, Charles. I must say I was rather amused by your reference to the possibility of translating our piece into several different languages. I do hope that one of those doesn't have to be English. We did make a serious attempt for it to be readable. I feel absolutely delighted to have won the Wolfson Prize. In fact, I feel a bit like one of those Oscar Prize winners who goes to the podium and, you know, bursts into tears and thanks all sorts of people. I must say, I don't look much like one of those Oscar Prize winners. Certainly not Gwyneth Paltrow, who I think was the most serious offender. And I'm not going to burst into tears, but I am going to give quite a lot of thank yous. First of all, to my colleagues at Capital Economics, because this was very much a team effort. There were 7 of us, 6 of whom are here today. The other one is not here simply because he's visiting a client, which is one of the occupational hazards of our business. They've done a splendid job. They had to be cajoled, it has to be said, into accepting the challenge. But once they accepted it, then they did a wonderful job, and I couldn't have done this without them. Second, I'd like to thank Lord Wolfson, not just for the generosity of this prize, but also for his imagination in conceiving of it and his public spiritedness. At a time when there are so many assaults on the business world, I think it's really remarkable and outstanding for Simon Wolfson to have done this, and he represents, in my view, the best in British business. Then the judges I'd like to thank. Partly for making the right decision, I suppose, but also for having to put up with all of these entries. It must have been bad enough for us, but struggling through all these hundreds of entries, it must have been quite a task, particularly the second dose when after we'd all been sent away to redo it and improve it. In particular, I'd like to thank Derek Scott, who, as we've heard, sadly can't be here, and also Professor Charles Goodhart for standing in for him. I'd also like to pay tribute to the other finalists. British elections, as I guess you all know, it's customary for the winning candidate to say it's been a fair fight, etc. Well, it wasn't a fight at all. But after we got to the shortlist stage, I did read all the other entries reasonably thoroughly, and I have to say I was both impressed and scared because there was an awful lot in there that I thought was very valuable, and as far as I'm concerned, they also, not only us, but they also have made a significant contribution to the stock of knowledge, and I commend them for their efforts. Now, I have to say it's been an extraordinary business doing the work for this prize, not just the hard work, although there has been an awful lot of hard work, and as you already heard, it ended up being more of a struggle than we'd anticipated because there was a second stage. In fact, after we'd completed the revision and entered the second stage, I had nightmares that there was going to be a third stage. That's to say, the judges were going to meet and say, well, there isn't a clear winner, you must go away and do something else. And I thought in the meantime, Greece would leave and the whole thing would blow up. So work was a problem. Actually, it was uncertainty was the major issue. I can't think of anything else I've ever done that's quite like this, because you decide to enter the prize and you've no idea, of course, how many people are going to enter, who they are, how good the entries are going to be, quite what you're taking on. And you're not sure at all that there's going to be any reward at the end of it. So that was quite extraordinary. The only thing I think it could remotely be compared to is what happens when you start a book. I know Charles has written several and I've written a few. In Charles's case, he knows it's bound to be published and successful. In my case, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure I was going to actually sustain the effort for a start, and it was actually going to appear, never mind be bought by and read by members of the public. This, I think, came some way close to that. In that regard, I must also thank, by the way, my publisher, because he's managed to rush out a new edition of my latest book, The Trouble with Markets, containing a new chapter based on the Wolfson essay. Now, I'm not going to summarise the essay in any detail. I'll just say a few words about it, if I may. Several of you will have seen it, or you've got it available now. The central case that the essay takes is of a country that wants to leave the euro. Now, there are all sorts of ways in which the euro might well break up, and we examine some of those, but the central case is one country that leaves. And we've done that, the central case, partly because we think it's the most likely way that the system will break. One country leaves and then possibly other countries follow, but also because analytically it's simplest and most useful in that so many of the problems that need to be addressed can be addressed simply in that way, examined analytically, broken down. And then, of course, if other countries want to leave or if strong countries want to leave, whatever, these problems can be dealt with in the same framework. Sometimes you reverse the signs, the amounts are bigger, but essentially it's the same analysis. Now, briefly, our idea is that the country should prepare to leave the euro in secret. That's to say, we don't think it would be possible, at least not optimal, to be preparing in the open. There'd be a danger of massive capital flight and banking collapse. Capital controls and closures of the banks would be necessary for a short period after an announcement was made, which would preferably be over a weekend. The country would redenominate domestic monetary amounts into the new currency. And we suggested that the exchange rate, the conversion rate, should be 1 for 1. So if it was drachmas, for instance, whatever an amount was in euros, I don't know, 345 euros, would suddenly become 345 drachmas. Now, that's not actually a critical point, but it proves to be extremely useful and convenient. I think a lot of members of the public get confused between the conversion rate, the official conversion rate, and what subsequently the exchange rate comes to be, because the government can declare whatever conversion rate it likes. In the end, what really determines the effectiveness of this change is what the foreign exchange markets do, and we're pretty confident that the foreign exchange markets would instantly take the effective exchange rate to a completely different level from the conversion rate, and that's not to be regretted. That is the essential part of the mechanism through which this works. We then suggest the adoption of a new policy regime in order to ensure macroeconomic stability and encourage expectations that this is going to be successful. This would include inflation targeting, the banning of indexation, a new fiscal framework, and the setting up of an independent body. Now, I know a lot of people thinking about this issue consider that the business of notes and coins is tremendously important. And indeed, that's the way we thought of it. How can you cope with this issue? It takes 6 months to print notes. And then when you start thinking about it, this proves to be, I think, a non-issue. It's one of the least important aspects of the problem. We concluded that there was no need for notes to be instantly available, and accordingly, the commissioning of new notes and coin could wait until the announcement of the withdrawal. And the solution is that you use all forms of electronic and card money in the interim, which after all for business transactions account for the vast majority anyway. And for those amounts which have to use cash, you simply carry on using euros. So there is effectively a dual currency system in the interim before new notes are available. Now, our essay doesn't come up, therefore, with a sort of completely novel or, if you like, clever solution to this problem. It's a detailed, thorough examination of all the aspects. I don't think there is an effective, clever solution to the problem. That's not what's necessary. What's necessary is an understanding of the fundamental economics and then detailed application of those fundamental economics to the undoubted practical complications and legal complications of the euro. Now, you didn't have to be a raving Eurosceptic to enter this prize, and we certainly weren't, or at least most of us weren't. The spirit in which we entered it was we thought this was a very important practical question which needed an answer, and we hope to make both a contribution to it and to learn something from the process of actually writing the essay. Having said that, it does seem obvious to me that Europe is in the midst of what could well be an appalling catastrophe. It's an economic tragedy, and it could end up being a political and social tragedy. How has it happened? It's happened because the politicians, the European politicians, have made a mess of it. They had a dream, didn't fully understand the economics, and they botched its implementation. This isn't to say, as it were, that the British Eurosceptics got it right, because lots of them got it wrong. I'll point to one particular body who I think had it right from the beginning, and they're certainly not British, and that's the German Bundesbank. The Bundesbank was right all along. Now, in our suggested plan for a country to leave, there would, of course, be losers from these events, but it's pretty clear to us about the time profile of the balance of losers and gainers. Losers in Greece, if it were Greece to leave, for instance, immediately. But pretty soon afterwards, we think the Greek economy would recover very strongly, and there would be an awful lot of gainers in Greece and elsewhere, in particular the Greek unemployed. In this developing tragedy in the eurozone, I have sympathy with, as it were, both sides of the present dispute. That's to say, I sympathise with those people in Northern Europe, particularly in Germany, who feel anger and dismay at the idea of having to subsidise southern countries who they often feel aren't acting appropriately, not working, not paying their taxes, etc. One could understand how your hard-working German burgher feels about all that. I sympathise with them. I also sympathise with unemployed Greeks who, often through no fault of their own, can't make a reasonable living. And for all those people in Greece and other countries who are suffering from the current policies and, frankly, can't see a way out. In fact, I don't think there is a way out. It's not their fault, it's the system that is at fault, and it looks to me as though it has to break. So that's the way in which we approach this question, to make a contribution to this developing debate about how to get a return to stability and prosperity in Europe. And surely, on the desirability of that objective, Eurosceptics and Europhiles can be united. Thank you very much.
Roger, congratulations, and congratulations to everyone at Capital Economics. I wondered if we might also have a little bit of time for some Q&A as well. I'm sure people have lots of questions about the winning entry and some of the other entries too. So if you can put your hands up and you let us know who you are and where you're from, that would be incredibly helpful. And we'll take first the lady in the third row, and then we'll come over there. And there's a microphone going to come to you.
Thank you very much. Imke Henkel with Focus magazine. What idea do you have for the significant debt that, in case one country leaves the euro, will remain with, especially Germany, through Target 2?
So I didn't quite get the question.
What plans do you have for the significant debt that will remain with Germany, especially through Target 2, and if one country leaves the euro?
Yeah. There's no doubt there are significant problems about debt. The departing country will redenominate its debt into the new domestic currency. So what was euros now becomes drachma. Now there are several significant legal problems about this, which we go into in our paper. And the general principle is that where debt is governed by domestic law, the government in question has the ability, the legal ability, to redenominate that debt into whatever currency it chooses. Now, where the debt instruments are not governed by domestic law, and in most cases, if they're not domestic law, they tend to be English law, then there's a significant problem because the law seems to say that the debt is still in that currency. So these countries that leave, let's say, for the sake of argument, Greece, which have significant amounts of debt to other eurozone members, including debt through the central banking system to the ECB, in the form of Target 2 balances with the Bundesbank, there's a huge problem because they are going to owe euros and they're still going to be denominated as euros. Well, there's going to be a fantastic argument about this. There's no doubt whatsoever. There's a dispute. And the countries in question, the departing countries in question, will be in a difficult position to pay. I think there's no doubt that some of the creditors of countries like Greece will end up not being repaid. However, I don't think you should stack that up and say, aha, it means that leaving the euro is going to be disastrous. And lots of people do this. And the underlying assumption is that if the euro continues and Greece carries on in the euro, that they are going to be able to pay this money back to the Bundesbank, etc. Well, are they? How are they going to be able to? Because their economies aren't growing. In the end, the ability to service debt and to repay debt is completely dependent, funny this, on real economic growth. I mean, if there's no growth, there's no money to pay. It's as simple as that. So it's saying that they owe the money, and under the current system, they'll get the money back. And if, by contrast, they leave the system, they'll have to, in some sense or other, to default. I think that's completely beside the point. It's all about the ability of countries to pay.
Did you make any calculations towards the sums?
We did, and there's a whole section in the report on that. We've got actually the particular individual who did that bit of work. Unfortunately, he's not here, but if you're interested, I mean, by all means, do look at the report, and we'd be very happy to answer questions later, detailed questions, if you have them.
Roger, would you mind just moving to the other side of the stage?
Oh, sorry.
So it's your podium's in the way of you there. I want to be able to see you. That's great.
I might even encourage you, if you can come to the podium, to the forest of microphones. It'd be easier if you do this. We'll swap places. Oh, right. We'll take the next question. Let's put this up here. Let's put it back on the top. Oh, there we go. So these presidential press conferences. There's a gentleman in the third row.
Markus Teuer, Frankfurt Allgemeine in Germany. Question on contagion. What do you recommend to prepare for that? I mean, I just read the conclusions, and you say, well, one should speed up political union, which is easily said, but hard to achieve. So what else can and needs to be done because contagion could happen very quickly, and the prospects of creating a closer political union, that seems to be a long-term project in a democratic society. That's the first question. And the second is, do you have any idea how much of transfer might be needed to the leaving countries in order to ease their pain and to bolster social stability in these countries?
Well, on the first question about contagion, of course, that's not a problem for the country leaving. An important point this, because that is the perspective from which we wrote the essay. You know, you are Greece or Italy or Portugal or whatever, and as Simon Wolfson said, there was an intellectual vacuum. How on earth should you do this? And so our essay is trying to answer that question. How should you do it? And we certainly don't say, well, you should worry about contagion to other Eurozone countries. That's the last thing I'd advise them to be concerned about. But for the other Eurozone members, I think the issue is rather more fundamental than you're implying, and I think they have to think through a feasible shape for the Union. Now, if a country like Greece, for instance, leaves in a disorderly way and it's followed by a period of chaos, I suspect that contagion will not, for a time, be a serious problem, because the politics within the other supposedly vulnerable countries will favour continued austerity. And it would then make sense, I think, for Germany and other countries to bend a bit, to agree to something that might even, on a small scale, resemble what's been called a Eurobond, to give some sort of guarantee to weaker countries or weaker banks. I suspect without Greece, it will be easier for Germany and the other northern core countries to do that. But ultimately the question has to be faced, and it's not being faced now, is does it make sense for a monetary union accompanied by a fiscal and political union to take place with the remaining members? I don't think it does. And we argued that clearly in the paper. I think myself that the biggest danger from contagion, and we say this in the paper, would be if Greece manages to make a success of leaving the euro. Now, it could go either way. I mean, if Greece makes a complete mess of it, this is, by the way, the exact opposite, the way that the political classes, if I can call them that, tend to think about this. They think the greatest dangers to the rest of the system are from all the chaos that might result from a messy exit. Now, clearly there would be some difficulties in that direction, but for reasons I said, I think the politics then go in the other direction. That's to say, it's easier to keep the other members together. But suppose that Greece leaves, and after a year or a year and a half, this looks like one of those devaluations, coupled with some default, which actually is working, and not all of them do, but there's a long list that have. Britain in 1931 and 1992, Argentina in 2002, Asian countries in 1997, 98. Supposing Greece begins to look like that, at that point, I think it's going to be an impossible job to keep the other vulnerable members in the system, because politicians in those countries saying to their electorates, you've got to swallow this nasty medicine, you've got to do what Mrs. Merkel says, they frankly will not be credible. If they try to say there's no alternative, the voters will turn back and say, oh yes there is, we could do what they've done.
And will that stop at some point, or do you think that if one country leaves, that's the beginning of the total integration of the euro?
Well, I've just said, I think it depends a lot, actually, on how well Greece does. I could see ways in which the rest of the eurozone, there's no reason why it couldn't hold together, but certain things have got to be done to hold it together. I think myself, and I think Charles Goodhart said this earlier on, that even in those circumstances, there would be a very heavy economic price to be paid, because none of these methods of keeping the eurozone together do anything about addressing the fundamental economic problems, which is to do with competitiveness. So that will be a way of ensuring, I think, very low growth at best in the eurozone for a long time, and possibly no growth. Now, very briefly, you secondly asked about transfers. I don't think myself that there would need to be direct transfers. What would need to happen, though, I think, is that the other countries, it would be better if the other countries, rather than going off in a huff and feeling let down, actively cooperated with the exiting country. And for instance, on the question of debt, it would be much easier if they accepted that they were not going to get all their money back. And we had some agreement about that and cooperation. If, for instance, they also agreed that this country could stay in the EU. Now, we don't see any legal reason why such a country shouldn't stay in the EU, but clearly there would be a lot of argy-bargy and argument. It's in the interests, we think, of the rest of the eurozone to cooperate with the exiting country.
There's a gentleman in the back row there.
Rory Anderson, CNN. Roger, congratulations. If you were a betting man, would you be prepared to wager the £200,000 you've just been awarded on the eurozone breaking up?
What a fascinating question. Well, I am a betting man, actually, but only for very small stakes, you see, because I'm rational, but I've also got some of the characteristics of people who appear in behavioural economics. I'm very heavily influenced by feelings of regret. And I think this is a huge sum of money, and it wouldn't be sensible for me to gamble it, would be the first thing. Secondly, I think my co-winners would murder me, because although I'm a betting man, they're not, you see, and the money's partly theirs.
There's a lady in the third row.
Catherine Hopkins from The Times. Obviously, you're just talking about Greece at the moment as the first country to leave, but if others followed, which ones do you think would be first to go? And is your view in that in the long term there would be the core countries that would form a strong northern euro, and then eventually a number of weak peripheral nations would go back to their national currencies?
Yeah. Well, I don't think we've got anything novel to say about the first part of that, but I think we have got something to say about the second part. That's to say, the vulnerable countries are the obvious ones: Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece and Spain. Greece, in our view, is the most vulnerable. Now, in some ways, you could say that Spain is next in line, not least because the amounts of money that will be needed to stabilise the situation would be so large. However, my own view is that this isn't the only issue in question. There's also a political dimension to this, and the way in which the rest of the Eurozone establishment regards the country in question. And one of the vital elements of the Greek situation has been the way that Greece lost the confidence of the other Eurozone members. Now, at the moment, I think, despite various difficulties, Spain still has the confidence of the rest of the Eurozone, and accordingly that the northern core countries would go to, I think, serious efforts to keep Spain in. Now, Italy, you could say, is also in that category. After all, the EU was set up, the Treaty of Rome. However, Italy has got some very serious political problems. And let's say Italy had carried on under the previous administration, I think we might well have got to the point where other Eurozone leaders felt complete and utter exasperation. And it's the combination of the huge amounts of money and the dire economic circumstances with, I think, that lack of common feeling and sympathy, which elevates a country up the list of those likely to leave. Now, where I think we made a contribution was in regard to this question that you ask about the core. In our view, probably the best way to realign the eurozone would be for northern core countries, including Germany, based on Germany, to leave the euro, leaving the euro as the currency of the southern countries. Now, having said it's the best, I don't think it's the most likely. The most likely scenario, I suspect, is one in which a series of weaker southern countries leave the euro, and the northern core then remains, consisting of Germany, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Austria, Finland, probably Belgium. An interesting question then about France, which seems to me could go either way. We do, however, in the paper say that we don't think it would make sense for there to be a southern euro. The optimum situation is probably where each of these southern countries ends up with its own currency, because they're so different one from another. But the northern core, yes, some sort of monetary union could and probably should survive.
This gentleman in the back row, then we'll come to the front.
Hi, it's Mike Dolan at Reuters. Can I get back to the Greek situation where you say advocating a secret planning of this exit? I mean, how do you think the government there should square opinion polls that are saying 70–80% of the population still wants to remain in the euro? Do you think it's a democratic process if the government were to go and prepare secretly for something that the population does not necessarily want?
Well, there are all sorts of instances where things of this sort happen. I mean, we're obviously not quite at the moment at the point of exit. And when I say you should prepare secretly, I think the mechanism through which this is likely to come to a head is either further abject economic misery in Greece, at which point I think your opinion poll numbers will change, or a crisis centred on the banking system where even more deposits flee Greece, and the Greek central bank has to get accommodation through the euro system, which in the end is not forthcoming. And dare I put in a plug in this instance for the Wolfson Prize. I mean, I hope this does figure large in Greece. I hope it is going to be reported extensively in Greece. Maybe we can do something to influence those opinion poll numbers. That's to say, the more feasible people think that it is, and the less they're taken in by the idea that it's going to be a complete disaster, then maybe those opinion poll numbers will start to change. But the last point I want to make is, you know, on these major crisis occasions, governments don't have the luxury of consulting focus groups or opinion polls. I mean, they have to make a decision in the heat of the moment. And mostly, I think the opinion polls, by the way, if they had been consulted, would have got it wrong. I mean, on the eve of Britain's departure from the gold standard in 1931, do you think if you'd conducted a poll and said to people, would you like Britain to leave the gold standard and go it alone, do you think you'd have got a majority? I'm pretty sure you would not. And yet it was the best thing we could have done and set in train the fastest rate of economic growth in the whole of Britain's economic history. On the eve of Britain's exit from the ERM on September the 16th, 1992, do you think if you'd asked an opinion poll of people, having slogged away in the ERM, sorry, Freudian slip, for 2 years, would you like Britain to leave? Or subsidiary question, you know, the Alex Salmond one, subsidiary question, would you like Britain to be booted out by George Soros? You know? Late in the afternoon, I don't think you'd have got a majority, and yet that was clearly in the best interests of Britain.
Right to the front.
Ali Sheikh al-Islam, Euronews. I'm glad you mentioned the possibility of Germany leaving, because I thought it was just my fantasy, so thank you for sharing that. But if that happens, and I understand it's very unlikely, what would be the implications of that for the wider Eurozone? Because when a, let's say, vulnerable country leaves, I think it's a very different story.
Yeah, I don't think it's a ridiculous idea at all. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Charles Goodhart, who's sitting here, has written about it, and several other people have written about it too. And I wouldn't dismiss it as completely impossible even now. Indeed, the more difficult the euro situation becomes, the more German money that's at stake, and the more exasperated German leaders and public become, the more it begins to be a serious proposition. I think the fundamental reason why it's not being looked at actively, so I don't think it is to do with politics and the history of Europe. You know, there's an enormous amount at stake here. Germany's invested so much in this project. If Germany were to leave, it would be making a pretty important statement about the future shape of Europe, and I don't think they're prepared to make that statement. To my mind, one of the two leading advantages of Germany leaving, together with a group of northern countries, are twofold, really. First of all the difficulties surrounding the construction of a new currency, new policy regime, all that sort of stuff, they're borne by the strong countries rather than the weak countries. And secondly, associated with that, the weak countries can continue to borrow in the euro, that's their domestic currency. So you save that sort of difficulty. Now, it still wouldn't be very easy, and there would be all sorts of issues about whether the euro was still the euro. Actually, I think there'd be important legal challenges as to whether those countries were still running a currency called the euro, given that Germany and so many of the other northern countries had left. But on balance, I think that would probably be better. But politics took the centre of all this. And we didn't put this as our central case because we wanted to be of practical use. This is what Lord Wolfson set us as a task. You know, well, it's a practical question to be answered. And it was no good concentrating, we thought, on what was an interesting and maybe the best way of breaking the euro up if it didn't seem to be practically relevant. And the practically relevant case is the one we adopted, namely, how should a country that wants to leave, how should it leave?
We're just about to run out of time, and I just wonder if there's a last question from anyone in the room. Gentleman, second row.
Panos Charalabus from London Greek Radio. I wanted to get back to the previous argument about why should a Greek exit lead to a European fiscal union? Why do you need a Greek exit in order to have a monetary union?
Yeah. Well, I think the fundamental logic of the links between monetary, fiscal and political union is pretty clear. It was laid out a long time ago. So what's gone wrong in the eurozone isn't at all novel or surprising. I mean, going back to one of my previous mentors, Donald McDougall, he laid this out pretty clearly. Economists, orthodox economists, have known all this for ages and ages and ages, and plenty of people said it at the time that the eurozone was formed. So what we've had is effectively a halfway house, if you like. It's, if you like, monetary union light. And what has to happen if the euro is going to survive is, it seems to me, you either have to go all the way, do the job properly, or break up. Now, what I was saying about Greece...
Well, Greek exit would trigger like Eurobonds, as you said.
Well, there's no automatic connection here. What I was trying to suggest was that I think there's a sense on the part of the Eurozone establishment of complete exasperation with Greece. There's a thought that Greece is a hopeless case. Leaders feel let down by Greece. They felt let down, first of all, by the, how should we say, manipulation about Greece's figures prior to joining the Union, and then the way that the referendum, which never took place, was sprung last autumn. They feel exasperated, and at the same time looking at the Greek numbers, it does look appallingly difficult. So I think the fear on the part of the German leadership and others in Northern Europe is that if Greece is allowed to continue in this way and Germany makes massive concessions, it will be impossible actually to keep not just Greece but the other members actually under control. Now, by contrast, if Greece actually leaves the Union, I think there are two things. First of all, from their point of view, the worst case has gone, and I think they will suspect that other countries will immediately feel that the Greek position is something to be avoided, anything but that. And in that atmosphere, there's the potential for a bargain. That's to say, the Germans to make concessions, the other countries to batten down the hatches, to swallow their medicine, to cede some sovereignty. In that sort of atmosphere, a deal might be easier.
So Greece has a gaming for the whole Europe.
You might well think that. I couldn't possibly comment.
Sorry, so is it an economics argument or a cultural argument? Is it like
Economics or?
A cultural one. I mean, stop lying.
Oh, I'm sufficiently broad-minded. No, I'm sufficiently broad-minded about economics that I can't accept an either economics or culture. I'm afraid culture's got to be part of it as well. Economics is a very broad subject, and you've got to take account of culture and political factors too.
On which note, I'm afraid we are out of time. However, copies of the winning entry are at the back of the room. All of the finalists are on our website. I think that members of the Capital Economics team will be around if you want to have a chat to them at the end. And I wonder if I could encourage all the people from the Capital team to come up on stage so we can get a group photograph of you all. And it only really remains for us to congratulate the winners of the Wolfson Economics Prize.